tell from the colour of my hair that I've been around the sun a few times. I say that I am in my third act of life. In my first act, I trained to be a teacher. I'd always wanted to be a teacher since I was 8 years old. And while 8-year-old me would not have been able to cognitively say why, as I reflect back, having grown up in a conservative Christian tradition where the voices of authority were men, I can see that women's being an authority, the place I saw that was in teaching, in education. And so that's the path I chose to take and did training in after I left high school. The reality is, I think I was a born teacher. I was teaching, helping other people learn long before I'd done any training. So I think there was both that combination of being a woman with some authority, but also following a passion, a gifting that I had been given. Alongside that, I also saw played out ahead of me in my mother's generation that women, when they got married, they left the workforce because my mother had needed to leave working in the Commonwealth Bank, one of the big banks here in Australia, when she married in the early 1950s, because she wasn't allowed to stay as a married woman because it was deemed improper for a woman to do that who might be taking a job away from a man who had a family to support. So I saw that as the pattern for me. And so probably 2 or 3 years after I got married, I decided that I needed to stop. I wanted to start a family with my husband. And that's the path that I pursued for the next 15 or so years. Ended up having 3 sons. In the meantime, I did return to teaching, to casual teaching, taught a number of different grades. In the end, over my teaching career, I taught children from aged 5 to age 12. I also taught some preschool children, so little ones, 2, 3 and 4-year-olds. And I also worked in the field of special education, so teaching children who had a variety of disabilities. So I really felt as though I'd had this full, broad range of experience around teaching, which was very useful when I came into my last teaching role. So in the early 2000s, I took on a role in a small Christian school where there were multi-grade classrooms. So at one point I was teaching children from age 5 to age 12 all in the one classroom. And I finished my teaching career in 2004 as a school principal. So that was my first act. Those years of teaching, raising children, I developed so many skills, and I really want women to understand that if you choose to be a stay-at-home mum, you are not losing skills, you are actually gaining skills. Conflict resolution, managing household budgets and financing, so many different things, health, looking after the health of your family, feeding your family often. There are so many skills that women learn as a homemaker that are directly transferable, like conflict resolution, into the workplace. However, as much as I had seen my parents have a very happy marriage, and that was what I had anticipated mine would be, for about 15 years I had been deeply unhappy. I could not put my finger on what the problem was. I'd urged my husband and we'd gone to marriage guidance counselling, but nothing seemed to change. I just knew the relationship was dysfunctional. There came a time, a year or so after I'd finished my teaching career, that I felt I could no longer stay. And so I sat across the table from my then husband and told him why I was leaving. And when he said no, I clenched my hands together like this in my lap and said yes. And that, I believe, was the bravest thing I have ever done, because I was flying in the face of the example of my family. Nobody in my family was divorced. My parents had long marriages. My brother and sister, who are younger than me, they are still married to their first partner. So again, I was doing something very different. Of course, in my church, divorce was frowned on, and I'd spent about 4 years looking at different Bible verses, trying to come to grips with what does the Bible say? What does God want? And in the end, I had to decide what was best for me. And it was that sense of making the best decision that became a bit of a mantra. I'd spent my marriage trying to get this right, because I figured if I changed enough, then the marriage would change. But of course, for a marriage to work, it needs to have both people making the effort, and that wasn't happening because my husband couldn't see that there was any issues at all. And so my mantra became, I'm going to make the best decision that I can, given the information that I had at the time. I gave up with this idea of getting things right. I was in completely new territory, uncharted territory, as I moved into separation and divorce, and my whole world, I was turning my world upside down by making that decision. So into my second act, now I'm divorced and I move into a second career. Having a strong Christian foundation, I joined the Salvation Army, which is a Christian-based welfare organisation, and I went and trained with them in Sydney to be a Salvation Army officer. Now, what that involved was becoming an ordained minister of religion. I did a degree in theology, ended up doing an honours paper as well. During my time as a Salvation Army officer, I worked in Canberra, in Sydney, but the most significant thing I did was to go to Nauru, which is a tiny island in the Pacific, about 4 hours flight from Brisbane. Now, the Australian federal government had an agreement with the Nauruan government to open or reopen the offshore processing centre there on Nauru for asylum seekers. So as people came largely via Indonesia on leaky, fairly unseaworthy boats, they were then transferred to Nauru for processing, which for them was a completely traumatic process. And I had the opportunity to go and work there with the Salvation Army, providing welfare services. I didn't have a burning desire to work with refugees, and certainly didn't have a burning desire to work in the tropics. But I put my hand up because I couldn't think of a reason why not to. And that decision became pivotal. So here was I, a white woman in her 50s, grown up in largely white Australia, in a conservative Christian tradition where everybody thought like me, spoke like me, looked like me, and I land in a Pacific Island culture, and I work with asylum seekers from hugely different backgrounds, from Iran and Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and some from Asia and Africa, speaking all these languages that I didn't know anything about, like Dari and Urdu, Farsi, Tamil, Arabic. And most of the asylum seekers were Muslims who come from Muslim countries. So diametrically opposed, well, so I thought, to my Christian faith. It was so challenging for me. And my body, on that very first day that I walked down into the camp, my shoulders are tension, my stomach's churning, and I just felt deeply, deeply uncomfortable in a place where there was so much difference. I felt threatened by it. As I reflected over those first 4 weeks on what my body was telling me, having grown up in a tradition that said, the mind, the will, that's the primary, this was the first time I'd actually listened to my body, and I realised my body was telling me something that my brain hadn't yet caught up with, that I was afraid. I was afraid of these people who were so different to me. Somewhere along the line I realised that I had learnt that difference was a threat. And I think we learn that unconsciously when everybody around us is the same as us. If somebody is different, well, they must be wrong. There must be something wrong about them. You don't want to be involved with those people because they're different. As I realised that, I came to understand that sense around difference being a threat, there was an underlying racist bias to it, which shocked me, because I would have said I didn't have a racist bone in my body, but I realised I'd absorbed these racist outlooks purely from where I'd grown up and the messaging that I had received. Once I knew that, I then had the opportunity to decide, well, do I want to continue to following that path, or can I make a different path in my thinking? And I chose a different path, because then I flipped that difference is a threat on its head, and I look now as difference as an asset. And as soon as I could do that, I was able to learn from the people around me, the people that I worked with, who were very different to me. I was open to hearing what they could speak into my life, what they could teach me. One of the other challenges that confronted me was as I listened to the wider expats who were working on Nauru and how they spoke to the Nauruans who were on their team, the attitude that they had, and I could see it in myself. It was like, hello, first world country, university educated, of course we know best. I thought, I don't really like this sense of superiority, but I wanted to find out more. So I sat down with a woman called Fatima, who was heading up the Nauruan section of the Salvation Army team, and said, this is what I'm observing. And her response floored me. She said, we know that about you guys, but we just accept it. She reflected back to me what I had been observing. And that was the first time that I understood about white superiority and white privilege. So pivotal, this time on Nauru, this time as a Salvation Army officer, where I learned so much about myself, about how I thought about the world, about things that had been previously hidden to me. I returned to Australia, ended up moving to Melbourne with the Salvation Army. And when I turned 60, I decided it was time to step out on my own, to leave employment. And so I entered the third act of my life. I had always wanted to be a professional speaker. I'd been speaking as a public speaker, both in education and as a Salvation Army officer, delivering messages at work. I've been doing that for 30 years. And I thought, can I now monetize this? Can I turn this into something I can make a living from? So that was 2016. So for the last 9 years, that's what I've been doing. I've been building a speaking business, a speaking and training business. And where I have landed now is to really focus on women and their leadership, the leadership that they bring to others, but more importantly, the leadership that they bring to themselves. And I work with women, speaking to women about the power that we all uniquely have, power that is often hidden under cultural norms, family expectations around the language that we hear, the messaging like the one that I heard so often of sit down, be quiet and play small. All of these things, and I talk with women. I tell them that they're superheroes in disguise. So that's where I've landed. And now at nearly 70, I am going to be doing this for at least the next 10 years. I'm drawing together women in one way or another who, like me, are tapping into their power, because we have the ability to change the world just one action at a time.